The Sawyers of Shadow Creek were not just another frontier family. They were the storm every valley feared. America would come to know them as its most murderous clan. Before we begin this blood-soaked chronicle, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and then settle in, because this is not a story you will forget. The land at Shadow Creek held its own silence. The creek itself moved slow, shallow in most places, running brown over stones smoothed by time. It wound between fields where fences leaned and grasses bent in the wind, a line of water that gathered mist in the mornings and glittered faintly in the evenings before falling back into shadow. The valley had seen families come and go, each leaving behind traces: a rusted plough half buried in soil, a chimney standing alone where fire had long ago gutted the house around it, an orchard grown wild with branches tangled thick as thorns. The Sawyers came into this place at the turn of a season when winter still clung but spring pushed forward with thaw and mud. Their arrival stirred little at first. A wagon drawn by a mule rattled down the road, burdened with boxes, tools, and bundles of rope. Behind it came another, this one piled with mattresses, barrels, and a single iron stove lashed with wire. Silas Sawyer walked alongside, his boots sinking deep in the thawing ruts. His shoulders carried the heaviness of a man who had measured miles not by maps, but by each step pressed into earth. Merle, his wife, rode in the second wagon, back straight despite the jolts, hands resting on her lap as though she could steady the load by sheer will. The children were divided between the two wagons. The elder boy crouched among tools, the younger clutching a sack of grain, and the daughter seated close beside her mother, eyes fixed forward. They came to the farmstead that had been empty for 3 years. The house stood with its boards weathered grey, its windows uncurtained and blank, its porch sagging toward collapse. The barn loomed behind it, doors off their hinges, roof punctured by gaps where the sky shone through. A shed leaned sideways into weeds, and the fields lay rough with stubble, half swallowed by wild growth. Other families had looked upon this land and passed it by. The Sawyers stopped without hesitation. Silas set his hand to the gate, pushed it open with a groan of rusted hinges, and led the mule inside. Work began at once. Boxes were hauled in, boards torn away, shutters forced open. Smoke rose from the chimney by nightfall, drifting into the grey air, a sign that the house had been claimed again. Neighbours passing along the road slowed their teams to watch, some curious, others measuring in silence what sort of people would take such a place for their own. By the week's end, the Sawyers had cleared enough space to live within the shell of the house, and though its walls still leaned, light shone faintly through its windows when the sun fell. In Shadow Creek, people were noticed less by words than by patterns. The Sawyers' patterns set them apart from the beginning. At dawn, Silas was already in the yard, his form cutting through mist as he lifted boards, hauled stones, and straightened posts. Merle moved between house and yard with quiet persistence, carrying water, hanging clothes, tending to animals brought in cages and crates. The children roamed less freely than others their age. They followed their father into the fields, or their mother into the house, learning tasks without complaint, their faces marked by the same tight reserve that sealed their parents' expressions. Neighbours waited for gestures of introduction, a visit to the store with words exchanged, a nod at the churchyard, a child's laugh carried into play. What came instead was silence. When spoken to, The Sawyers answered in short phrases, never impolite but never opening further. They did not linger in town, did not stand in conversation, did not join the circles where men swapped weather reports and women compared prices of flour. Their business began and ended with necessity, and they returned always to their farm at the edge of the creek. By the first season, the changes on the land were plain. Fence lines, though still rough, no longer gaped. The barn doors, patched with mismatched boards, hung straight enough to close. A plough carved new lines into the earth, uneven but determined, breaking soil that had hardened through years of neglect. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning, steadier now, and lantern light burned late into the night. Passers-by spoke of hearing hammering after midnight, or of seeing shadows crossing the yard long after others in the valley had gone to bed. It was then that murmurs began, quiet at first. Not accusations, only observations turned to questions. Why did the family work so late? Why did they speak so little? Why did the children not join the others at the schoolyard? In Shadow Creek, difference itself was enough to seed suspicion. Yet the Sawyers gave no answers, no explanations, no invitations. Their silence became its own story, shaped and reshaped in the mouths of neighbors who watched from a distance. The first point of friction came, as it often did in rural places, with land. A fence post along the northern line was pulled and reset. Silas drove it firm into the ground, rope taut between it and the next. The neighbor whose field lay beyond came forward, pointing to the stone marker that had long signaled the corner. The post stood several feet beyond it. No one else heard what passed between them, only that voices were low, steady, without compromise. When the neighbor left, the post remained where Silas had placed it. Days later, another post was shifted. The fence line, once loosely agreed upon, was redrawn by force of will. Such incidents were small, yet in a place like Shadow Creek, they grew quickly in retelling. At the store, men spoke of the way Silas stood without flinching, eyes fixed, words spare. At church, women whispered of Merle's gaze, sharp and watchful even when lowered. Children told each other stories of the Sawyer boys along the creek, skipping stones not for play but in patterns that seemed like practice, each throw measured, each splash deliberate. The Sawyers endured each whisper by ignoring it. They neither defended nor explained themselves. They labored, repaired, planted, harvested. Their farm bore crops, their animals multiplied, their house no longer leaned so heavily against itself. By every outward measure, they had succeeded in reclaiming land thought ruined. Yet the distance between them and the rest of Shadow Creek only widened. They came to church once, sat silent in the back pew, and did not return. They sent their children to school for a brief term, then kept them home, saying nothing of why. They attended no suppers, joined no gatherings, stood apart at every turn. Seasons turned again. Snow melted into mud, mud hardened into dust, dust gave way to leaves and frost. Through each cycle, the Sawyers remained constant, present but apart, visible yet unreachable. Their place on the land became like a scar across the valley, accepted, endured, but never forgotten. The second year at Shadow Creek began with thaw. Ice broke from the banks in heavy slabs, drifting downstream until they caught against stones and splintered. The fields lay soggy, ruts filled with water that reflected the grey sky. Across the valley, farmers set their teams to ploughing as soon as the soil allowed, each man racing against the season, knowing that a late planting could strip a harvest bare. The Sawyers were no different in their labour, yet different in every other way. Silas worked alone with his eldest son at the plough, their mule straining against harness leather patched and repatched until it was more stitch than hide. The boy leaned into the handles, his face set in the same stern line as his father's. Together they cut furrows not straight but jagged, as though the earth resisted them. The younger boy trailed behind, gathering stones and piling them at the field's edge. The daughter moved along the rows with a basket, stooping to drop seeds in handfuls, her hands quick and practiced, her eyes never lifting to the road where others might pass. By the time the first green showed above the soil, the Sawyers had already marked themselves in the minds of neighbours, not by words spoken, for they spoke few, but by patterns repeated until they formed an image hard to ignore. Lanterns still burned late. Smoke rose at odd hours. The boys were seen carrying tools across fields under moonlight. Merle's wash hung on the line in rows that stretched longer than seemed possible, as if clothing multiplied in the night. No one asked directly, but questions turned over quietly in the post office, the store, the churchyard. The first quarrels over boundaries had not been forgotten. Carver, the neighbour to the north, still muttered about the posts Silas had shifted. He did not move them back, nor did he press the matter openly. Instead, he checked his fences twice, walked his cattle more often, kept his children close. Others noticed. In a valley where one man's grudge quickly became another's story, Carver's silence was louder than speech. It was in midsummer when the first true incident occurred. A dog went missing from the Stenson place, a black hound known to roam wide but always return at dusk. Days passed with no sign. Then, on a morning heavy with dew, the hound was found on the far side of the creek, across from the Sawyer land. Its body lay stiff in the reeds, eyes clouded, formatted with mud. There were no clear marks, no wounds that told a plain tale. Some said it had drowned, others whispered of a rope, but no one proved anything. Still, the fact that it lay so near the Sawyer fields was enough. Stenson carried the story into town, and from that day forward, the Sawyers were spoken of not just as strange, but as dangerous. Through it all, Silas gave no answer. He rose each morning before dawn, walked the land, worked his fields, returned at dusk with the same measured silence. Merle kept the household steady, her figure glimpsed through windows as she moved from stove to table, from washboard to yard. The children followed their routines as though carved into them, the boys to field and tool, the daughter to task and duty. None spoke against the whispers, none asked for trust. Their silence filled the gap where explanation might have been, and suspicion grew to fit it. By autumn, the community had shifted. Doors were bolted earlier. Strangers on the road were watched with longer glances. The creek itself became a boundary more than a landmark, a line that divided those who were of the valley and those who stood apart. And always at the edge stood the Sawyers, their farm patched and working, their presence undeniable, their intentions unreadable. Winter set in with heavy snow that year, pressing roofs under its weight, driving smoke from chimneys into a low sky. Travel slowed, gatherings thinned, nights stretched long. In that season, stories thickened more than facts. With little else to do, men at the store pieced together every oddity: the dog in the reeds, the midnight lanterns, the missing tools, the silent children. Each tale added to the next, until the Sawyers became less a family and more a shape that loomed in talk. Yet the Sawyers endured winter as they had endured every season. Their smoke rose steady, their lights glowed late, their footsteps pressed into the snow from house to barn and back again. They remained as constant as the creek itself, silent, flowing, unyielding. And Shadow Creek, whether it wished them there or not, carried them into another year. The thaw returned, and with it came the churn of another planting season. The earth softened beneath heavy boots, ruts filled with water, and wagon wheels cut deep into the lanes leading to the creek. Farmers of Shadow Creek moved in rhythm with the land, every year much the same as the last. Seeds pressed into furrows, teams strained against harness, and the smell of turned soil hung thick in the air. Yet beneath this rhythm, an unease had begun to flow. It spread not from the weather, nor from the soil, but from one family whose presence no one could ignore and no one could quite explain. The Sawyers had endured their second winter with the same silence that marked their arrival. Through storms and snow, their chimney had poured smoke, their lanterns had burned late, their routines had never faltered. And as the first green touched the banks of the creek, they resumed their labor with renewed force, as though the land itself owed them a debt they intended to collect. Silas Sawyer was seen more often now, not only in his fields but along the roads, walking distances others would ride. He carried little with him, sometimes only a length of rope or a sack slung over one shoulder. His face was steady, his pace deliberate, his eyes fixed always on the ground ahead. Men who passed him gave nods, but few received more than the barest tilt of his head in reply. Merle was glimpsed less, yet her presence was marked by what appeared in her wake. Lines of wash hung even in rain, baskets of vegetables carried to the porch, bundles of herbs drying on the sill of an open window. The children grew taller, their shapes sharper, their movements more deliberate. The elder boy began to mirror his father in stride and bearing, his jaw set in the same unyielding line. The younger trailed close behind, restless but obedient. The daughter carried herself with a stillness that unsettled those who caught her eye. Her silence was not shyness, but something harder, something that suggested she listened without offering anything in return. It was during this season that stories began to cling to the Sawyers like burrs to cloth. A tool left by the roadside disappeared, and someone swore they saw one of the Sawyer boys carrying it home. A wagon axle broke on the north road, and though no proof tied it to tampering, whispers pointed toward the farm at the creek. A calf vanished from Carver's field and was never found. Weeks later, smoke from the Sawyers' smokehouse hung heavy in the air, and tongues wagged in town. None of these accusations found ground, yet none of them died. Each was told, retold, and settled deeper into the soil of rumor until it took root as if it had always been true. Shadow Creek had always been a place where stories traveled faster than facts. A broken fence became theft, a stray animal became a raid, a late payment became dishonesty. By the time the stories reached the far side of the valley, they bore little resemblance to what had begun them. With the Sawyers, The process was sharper, more eager. People leaned closer when their name was spoken. Heads tilted, voices dropped. Glances cut toward the door to be sure no Sawyer lingered nearby. The most persistent tale was of the dog found in the reeds the year before. Stenson's hound had become more than an animal. It was a symbol repeated at every gathering. In one telling, the dog had been lured across the creek by Scraps. In another, it had been tied with rope and drowned. Some swore they had seen the elder boy carrying a heavy sack down toward the water that same week. None of these claims were confirmed, yet each retelling made them firmer, as if repetition itself was proof. Even the children of Shadow Creek carried the stories. They dared each other to walk the edge of the Sawyer fields at dusk, to count how many lanterns burned in the barn, to press their ears to the fence posts and swear they heard voices inside when no one should have been speaking. Fear made the game sharper, and soon the Sawyers were not just a family but a boundary in the minds of the young, the place where courage ended and caution began. For the Sawyers themselves, nothing outward changed. They continued their work with the same relentlessness. Fields were turned, crops planted, repairs made. The house stood straighter than before, patched though never polished. The barn doors closed tight, the fences held, the animals grew. By every measure of farming, they succeeded. But with each improvement, suspicion deepened. Their success was not seen as labor's reward, but as something taken, something borrowed at another's expense. It was in this third year that gatherings in Shadow Creek began to shift in tone. At the store, men spoke less of weather and more of caution. At the church, glances passed more quickly when the Sawyers' absence was noted. When tools went missing, when tracks appeared in the snow, when a chicken coop was found pried open, the unspoken answer hung ready: the Sawyers. No proof was needed. Their silence had become guilt in the eyes of others, their reserve a sign of hidden wrong. The creek itself, once only a ribbon of water, had become in people's minds a line of division. On one side lay the familiar, families who gathered, worked, quarrelled, and reconciled in the rhythm of the valley. On the other side stood the Sawyers, their farm patched and steady, their presence undeniable, their distance unbridgeable. And in that division lay the seed of what was to come, though no one yet named it aloud. The stories had taken root. What grew from them would not be shaken easily. The fourth year at Shadow Creek opened with rain. For weeks the sky hung low and heavy, the fields soaked until boots sank ankle-deep, and the creek swelled past its banks. Water pressed against fence posts and carved new channels through pastureland. Wagons bogged down, animals floundered in mud, and men cursed as seed rotted where it had been sown too early. To live in Shadow Creek was to know hardship in cycles, but this spring was harsher than most. It pressed against every family, testing stores of grain and patience alike. Through the storms, the Sawyers worked as if nothing had changed. Their mule dragged ploughs through mud, their children waded knee-deep to plant rows, their lanterns glowed across nights of steady downpour. Where others paused, they pressed on. Neighbours took notice. To some, it was proof of toughness, but to more it was unsettling. How could a family endure such conditions without faltering? Men shook their heads in the store, muttering that the Sawyers seemed to thrive where others struggled, that the rain did not weigh on them the way it weighed on everyone else. The more they worked, the more their labor was counted as a mark against them. By midsummer, when the rains eased and the fields dried, the divisions that had been building became sharper. Children no longer wandered near the Sawyer land. Women walking to church turned their faces when they passed the Sawyer fence line, their steps quickening as though distance itself were safety. Men who once tipped hats now kept their hands at their sides. If a Sawyer entered the store, conversations thinned until only the scrape of boots and the creak of the counter remained. If Silas laid coins on the table, the shopkeeper swept them away quickly, without the usual words that softened such transactions. It was during this season that stories hardened into something closer to belief. No longer were they told as whispers or possibilities. They were spoken as though known, repeated until they settled into the marrow of the valley. A man swore his missing tools had been spotted in the Sawyer barn. A woman claimed she saw Merle carrying bundles of cloth that matched what had gone missing from her line. Another insisted he had found footprints by his chicken coop, prints too large for a child and too narrow for a grown man, and in his telling they became the marks of the Sawyer boys. None of these accusations were proven, but none were forgotten. Each one added another layer to the distance between the family and the rest of Shadow Creek. Where once there had been curiosity, there was now certainty. The Sawyers were no longer only different, they were judged. In this fourth year, the creek itself took on a weight it had not carried before. Once only a stream to be crossed, it became in people's minds a barrier, a line of division as strong as any wall. Families on one side spoke of our land and our people, while the Sawyers were spoken of as something other, a presence tolerated but never embraced. Children repeated warnings given by parents. Do not go past the creek. Do not linger near the Sawyer fields. Do not speak with the Sawyer children. These words, once only caution, became law in the small world of the valley. The Sawyers, for their part, gave no answer. Silas continued his morning walks across the land, each step measured, eyes fixed. Merle carried on with her work, visible only in glimpses through curtains or quick passes across the yard. The boys grew broader in shoulder, their movements more deliberate, their silence deeper. The daughter carried herself with the same stillness as before, a figure that seemed at once too young and too old, too rooted and too apart. Harvest that year was thin for most. The rain had drowned seed, and the dry spell that followed had shriveled what survived. Wagons carried fewer bushels to barns, smokehouses held less meat, tables bent less under the weight of autumn meals. But the Sawyer harvest seemed steadier, their fields bearing more than others expected. Smoke from their chimneys rose thicker, their animals looked fuller, their stacks of wood higher. The sight of their success, in a year of want, cut deeper than any rumour could. Men who once muttered in corners now spoke with harder edges. Women who once whispered now pressed their warnings sharper into the ears of their children. Winter followed, long and sharp. Snow pressed heavy against doors, winds howled across the ridges, the creek froze in places and ran black in others. Families huddled close, measuring each day by how much would remain, how much food was left in bins. And through it all, the Sawyers' lights burned. Their smoke never faltered, their steps never slowed, their work never ceased. They endured, as they always had. Yet to those who watched from a distance, their endurance was no longer seen as strength, but as a shadow, a reminder that the Sawyers were not as others were, that they stood apart, that the creek divided more than land. By the close of that winter, the lines were drawn. The Sawyers on one side, Shadow Creek on the other. Each story told, each suspicion repeated, each glance averted had built into something solid. The family was no longer simply different. They were marked. The creek had become a border, and on its far bank, the Sawyers stood alone. The 5th year at Shadow Creek began not with storms, but with stillness. Spring came late, the frost holding longer than expected, the ground reluctant to soften. The creek, swollen with meltwater, ran high and fast, stripping banks of reeds and carrying branches down its length. The valley lay quiet, waiting for the thaw to give way fully, waiting for the soil to open again to work. In that waiting, people watched, and what they watched most was the Sawyer place. The farm had changed since their arrival. Where once the barn sagged and the house leaned, now both stood firm, patched though not polished, upright though not proud. Fences stretched straighter, gates latched more tightly, animals moved with a health not common to all in the valley. Their fields, even in the delay of the season, were ready sooner than others. When the thaw broke, their plough cut first into soil, their seeds went in ahead of rain, their mules strained against harness before most men had brought theirs from the shed. To some, it was a mark of diligence. To more, it was proof of something taken unfairly, a balance unsettled. Whispers grew sharper that year. It was said that seed was missing from store bins before planting, and though no Sawyer was seen to take it, their early planting was counted as evidence enough. It was said that tools borrowed were never returned. That wood cut from the ridge was found stacked in the Sawyer yard. It was said that when cattle wandered too near the creek, they returned leaner, ribs showing as though days had been lost in the space of hours. None of these things were proven, but proof was no longer required. Repetition had hardened suspicion into belief. Carver, whose land lay to the north, grew bolder in his complaints. He told any who would listen that his fences were cut in the night, that posts he set were pulled loose, that tracks pressed into the mud were too broad for his sons and too heavy for himself. Stenson, still remembering the loss of his hound, added his voice, claiming that shadows moved by the Sawyer barn even when no lanterns burned. Others, with less to tell, still nodded, their silence serving as agreement. By summer, a pattern had formed. Whatever went wrong, whatever was missing, whatever was unsettled, the Sawyer's name was tied to it. Through it all, the family gave no answer. Silas walked the land each morning, the same deliberate pace, the same steady gaze. Merle moved between house and yard, her work measured, her face unreadable. The boys had grown taller, their frames hard with labor, their silence deeper than before. The daughter, no longer a child, carried herself with a calm that unsettled more than any word could. They endured each glance, each mutter, each accusation, not with denial but with the same stillness that had marked them since the beginning. It was during harvest that the distance grew widest. The year proved kinder than the last. Rains came when needed, the sun held steady, the frost delayed. Wagons across the valley carried fuller loads, barns filled heavier, smokehouses hung thick with meat. Yet when people measured their yields against the Sawyers, they found themselves wanting. The Sawyer harvest stood higher, their stacks broader, their animals fatter. Envy, sharpened by years of suspicion, hardened into anger. At gatherings in town, their absence was now spoken of not with curiosity, but with resentment. Why did they never come to church suppers? Why did they never lend a hand when fences needed mending or wagons broke down? Why did they stand apart in all things yet still take from the same soil, the same rain, the same creek? Questions turned to declarations. The Sawyers were not simply distant. They were against community, against trust, against the unspoken bonds that held the valley together. Winter pressed in again, sharp and heavy. The creek froze thick, the wind cut deep, snow buried paths until fences vanished beneath drifts. In those months, families drew close, their gatherings smaller, their talk heavier. And always, at the center of such talk, the Sawyers' name returned. What began as whispers years before now sounded as near certainty, told with the weight of truth whether truth was present or not. By the time the thaw returned, the valley had changed. Lines that had once been blurred by politeness or habit had hardened. On one side stood the families of Shadow Creek, bound by suspicion and anger. On the other side, beyond the creek that gave the place its name, stood the Sawyers, silent, enduring, apart. The border was no longer only of water and land. It was of trust broken, of patience worn thin, of stories told so often they became the shape of reality. The creek divided, and the division was now complete. The 6th year opened with tension thick enough to be felt in every lane, every field, every gathering of men at the store. Winter had passed harshly, leaving stock thin and stores light. The thaw brought not relief, but a restless edge, for though the land promised a fair planting, the valley itself was restless. Where once disagreements had been spoken low, they now carried louder in the air. And always, at the center of them, lay the Sawyers. It was not one event that changed Shadow Creek in that year, but many small ones, each building on the last. In April, Carver's fence was found cut again, and this time 2 of his calves were missing. He rode the length of his land, searching tracks in the mud, following prints he swore led toward the Sawyer place. The prints disappeared on hard ground near the creek, but in his telling, that vanishing was proof enough. He carried his complaint to every neighbor, and the story spread until the missing calves were spoken of as theft rather than loss. In May, the Stenson barn caught fire. Flames rose quick and high, devouring roof and loft before water could be drawn enough to slow it. Men formed a line to douse what they could, but by morning the barn stood blackened and hollow, its beams charred, its rafters fallen. Stenson swore that lantern light had been seen near his fields the night before, a glow too low and steady to be accident. No one claimed to see who carried it, yet in every retelling, the light belonged to a Sawyer hand. By June, the stories had sharpened into threats. Men at the store spoke not only of caution but of action. Some said it was time to ride to the Sawyer place, to search their barns, to count their stock against what was missing elsewhere. Others urged patience, warning that such steps would bring trouble greater than what they already faced. But patience was thin, worn down by years of suspicion and envy. Each man carried some grievance, tools lost, animals gone, fences cut, and all found their way to the Sawyers' name. Through it all, the family remained unchanged. Silas walked his ground each dawn, the same steady pace, the same deliberate stride. Merle kept her house, her work unbroken. The boys, now near the strength of men, moved through fields and barn with hard purpose. The daughter, quiet and steady, kept her place in the shadows of the yard. They offered no denial, no defense, no explanation. Their silence, to the valley, was no longer endurance but defiance. The break came in midsummer. Carver, his temper long frayed, found one of his cows missing from pasture. Tracks led again toward the creek. He called to his sons, saddled his horse, and rode hard toward the Sawyer land. Neighbors, seeing his movement, followed at distance, some on foot, some on horseback, drawn not by invitation but by the promise of something long awaited. By the time Carver reached the fence line, a dozen eyes were on him. What passed there was told many ways. Some swore Carver shouted, calling for the Sawyers to come out and answer. Others said he climbed the fence, riding straight into their yard. A few claimed they saw Silas himself step from the barn, rope in hand, his face unreadable. What is certain is that Carver did not return as he left. His horse came back lathered and riderless, his sons following pale and shaken, their words stumbling, their eyes wild. By nightfall, Carver's body was found in the shallows of the creek, his head struck, his chest still. The news spread faster than fire. By dawn, the valley knew. Some called it murder, some misfortune, but none spoke without the Sawyers' name on their lips. Men gathered in knots, their voices rising with anger. Women pulled children close, whispering warnings sharper than before. The creek, once a border of land, had become a border of blood. The Sawyers did not flee. Their lanterns burned that night as they always had. Their smoke rose, their fields lay tended. No word came from them, no sign of sorrow, no mark of guilt or denial. To the valley, their silence was answer enough. The feud that had smouldered for years had found its first flame. From that summer forward, Shadow Creek was changed. Where once suspicion lingered, now hatred burned. Carver's death, spoken in every house, in every store, in every gathering, was no longer only his loss. It was a mark carried by the valley itself, a scar that would not fade, and at the heart of it stood the Sawyers, unyielding, unbroken, apart. The death of Carver did not fade as other troubles had. Most misfortunes in Shadow Creek were spoken of in heated tones for a week, then softened into memory by the next season's work. But this was different. A man's life taken at the creek was not a matter to be swallowed by time or weather. It returned each day in talk and temper, carried in lowered voices across store counters, in sharp whispers at the church steps, in mutters around the supper table. Carver had been no saint. His temper was short, his debts many, his quarrels loud. Yet in death, these things thinned. What remained was the image of a neighbor struck down, a man of the valley gone while those who lived apart from it endured. The Sawyers' name, already spoken with suspicion, was now weighted with blame. The story spread in forms that hardened with each retelling. Carver had been ambushed, Carver had been beaten, Carver had been drowned. In every version, the Sawyers were at the center. Men began to gather more often, not only in the store but in barns and sheds, their voices low but urgent. They spoke of order, of justice, of what was owed to Carver's kin and to the valley itself. They spoke of riding as a group to the Sawyer place, not for quarrel but for search, for proof, for answer, for some mark that would turn suspicion into certainty. Some pressed for it quickly, saying each day wasted was another day the Sawyers grew bolder. Others counselled waiting, warning that such action would bring blood rather than truth. But even among those urging caution, patience was thin. The women of the valley did not speak as openly, yet their silence was edged with fear. Children were kept closer to home, errands cut shorter, paths that skirted the creek avoided altogether. Warnings were sharper now. Do not wander, do not speak, do not linger. At church, prayers grew heavier, the sermons sharper, as if words alone could hold the valley together. But beneath the hymns and the scripture lay an unease that could not be eased by faith alone. The Sawyers themselves gave no change. Their lanterns still burned late, their mules still strained in the fields, their smoke rose steady from chimney and smokehouse alike. Silas walked his ground each morning with the same deliberate pace, as though the land itself were his only concern. Merle moved with her quiet constancy, her face unreadable, her work unbroken. The boys, near the full height of men, carried themselves with a hardness that was no longer youthful, but something sharper, heavier. The daughter, with her stillness, seemed more apart than ever, her presence unsettling even in silence. What drew most anger was not what the Sawyers did, but what they did not do. They did not come to Carver's burial. They did not step into town to speak a word of denial or sorrow. They did not open their barn, did not invite search, did not yield a gesture that might soften the valley's rage. Their silence was taken not as restraint, but as defiance. Their absence not as distance, but as guilt. By late summer, the talk of gathering had grown into planning. Men counted who might ride, who might carry arms, who would lead. They weighed whether to call on the sheriff from the county seat, though many distrusted him, believing law from outside would favor order over truth. Most argued the matter was for Shadow Creek alone to settle. In their eyes, the Sawyers were not a matter of courts or papers, but of survival, of keeping the valley from slipping into something darker. One evening, under a sky heavy with storm, a dozen men met in Stenson's barn. Rain pounded the roof, thunder rolled across the ridges, and in that noise they spoke with a frankness not yet heard before. They named the Sawyers a threat, not only for Carver's death, but for every missing animal, every cut fence, every vanished tool. They spoke of riding as one, not with questions but with demands, not with open hands but with rifles slung. By the time the storm broke, their course was set. Yet when the night cleared and dawn came, the valley did not rise as one. Some men hesitated, their wives urging caution, their minds weighing risk against gain. Others urged delay until harvest was finished, unwilling to put crops at risk in the heat of quarrel. So the march did not come, not yet. But the decision had been made in spirit, and the Sawyers' place was no longer only a farm on the far side of the creek. It was marked as enemy ground, set apart by more than distance, shadowed by intent. That autumn was heavy with waiting. Each man measured the Sawyers with harder eyes. Each family marked their absence with deeper resentment. The creek, swollen again with rain, ran like a scar through the valley, one bank bound by suspicion, the other by silence. And though no rifles yet rose, though no torches yet burned. All knew the storm had only been delayed. The first blood had been Carver's. The next would not be far behind. The 8th year of the Sawyers' presence at Shadow Creek began under a sky that would not settle. Spring came uneven, with sudden warmth followed by sharp frosts, rains that poured hard and then vanished into weeks of dry wind. The land bore the strain unevenly. Some fields sprouted strong, others lay patchy and weak. Livestock fared better in one barn and worse in the next. Across the valley, tempers wore thin, sharpened by weather, want, and memory. And at the root of it all, as always, lay the Sawyers. The Carver death still cast its shadow. Nearly 2 years had passed, yet in the valley it remained as present as the creek itself. Every quarrel circled back to it. Every new misfortune found footing in its telling. "Remember Carver," men muttered when tools vanished. "Remember Carver," women whispered when children wandered too close to the water. The Sawyers' silence, their refusal to answer, their steady, unbroken ways, made the story heavier with each passing month. By midsummer, the muttering had grown into movement. Small bands of men walked the edges of Sawyerland, not openly, but not hidden either. They lingered by fences, studied tracks in the mud, squinted toward barns. They spoke little when seen, but their presence was enough to mark the change. For the first time since the family's arrival, Shadow Creek no longer kept its distance. The valley had begun to press closer. It was Stenson, restless and bitter from the fire that had taken his barn, who pushed hardest. He swore that one of the Sawyer boys had been seen driving cattle across the creek at dusk, the animals lowing as though driven against their will. Others nodded, not because they had seen it, but because they wished to believe. Carver's sons, still raw from loss, lent their voices too. In every gathering the cry grew louder. It was time to act, time to demand, time to make the Sawyers answer. The moment came in late July. The sun hung heavy in a sky the color of iron, the air thick, the fields shimmering with heat. A group of men, numbering near 20, gathered by the store at dusk. Some carried rifles, others axes, a few only their fists, but all carried a settled anger. They did not shout, they did not march with noise. They moved as one, steady and grim, their boots raising dust as they crossed the lane and turned toward the creek. Word spread quick. Women pulled children inside, shutters closed, lamps dimmed. From doorways, faces watched as the line of men stretched across the road, their steps steady toward the far bank. No one followed, yet no one turned away. All of Shadow Creek, in its silence, bore witness. The men reached the Sawyer fence as the last light drained from the sky. Lanterns burned in the house, a dull glow in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. The mule shifted in its pen. Beyond the fence, the land lay still. The men stopped, forming a line. Stenson stepped forward, his voice carrying across the yard. He called for Silas Sawyer, demanded he step out, demanded he account for the wrongs laid at his name. His words, sharp and heavy, echoed across the field. At first there was no answer. The house stood quiet, the barn doors shut. The silence pressed heavier with each breath, until it seemed the valley itself was holding still. Then the door opened. Silas Sawyer stepped onto the porch, his figure framed by the glow behind him. He carried no weapon, no tool, only the weight of his presence. His face was unreadable, his posture steady, his eyes sweeping the line of men without flinch or falter. Behind him, shadows shifted, the shape of Merle at the window, the faint outline of the children within. Stenson shouted again, his voice rising, his words sharper. He demanded entry to the barn, demanded proof that stock inside was not stolen, demanded answers for Carver, for the fire, for every cut fence and missing tool. His words piled one on another, until they were not questions but accusations, not demands but sentences. Silas did not speak. He stood as he always had, silent, unyielding, apart. That silence, heavier than words, filled the space between the fence and the porch. The men shifted, their anger feeding on the stillness, their hands tightening on rifles and axe handles. Then came the first movement. One of Carver's sons, his face drawn with rage, swung a boot against the fence. The rail cracked, the post shuddered, the sound breaking the standoff like thunder. Others shouted, some climbing, some pushing, their bodies surging toward the Sawyer ground. What followed was chaos. Dogs barked from the barn, the mule kicked against its pen, the younger Sawyer boy ran into the yard with a length of wood in his hands. A shot cracked the air, no one certain from which side it came, but its echo rolled across the valley like a bell tolling the start of war. By the time night swallowed the yard, the men had withdrawn. Some limped, some carried cuts, all carried the weight of failure. The fence stood broken, the Sawyer land violated yet unyielding. No stock was found, no proof taken, no confession wrung. The Sawyers remained as they had been, silent and standing. But the valley had crossed a line that could not be undone. From that night forward, there was no pretense of peace. The Sawyers and the valley were no longer neighbors divided by suspicion. They were enemies divided by blood and fence posts, their feud carved deeper into the land with every breath. The storm that had been gathering for years had finally broken, and though the night had ended with withdrawal rather than death, all knew the next would not end so lightly. The confrontation at the fence did not vanish into silence. It lingered in the valley like smoke after a fire, clinging to every gathering, every conversation, every glance across the creek. The men who had gone that night returned with nothing in their hands, no proof, no confession, no victory. They had carried their anger to the Sawyer place, and they had come back with it sharpened rather than spent. To stand before the house, to see Silas silent on the porch, to find no weakness, no crack, had left them angrier than before. And in Shadow Creek, anger did not rest long. The next days were filled with talk, heavy and relentless. At the store, voices rose in recounting. Some claimed shots had been fired from the Sawyer house. Others swore they had seen movement in the barn as if stock was hidden there. Stenson told his version again and again, each time adding more weight, more threat, more certainty. Carver's sons, their pride as raw as their grief, pressed for action without delay. Their father had fallen, their fences cut, their cattle lost, and now the insult of being turned away stood atop the rest. They would not wait, they said. The Sawyers had to pay. At the same time, the Sawyers carried on as if nothing had changed. The broken rail was mended by morning, The mule returned to steady work. The boys walked their rows with tools in hand. The lantern burned each night. The smoke rose each day. Not a word passed from their lips into the valley. To their neighbors, this was not endurance but defiance. The silence was sharper than any denial could have been. Retaliation came quiet at first. One night, Stenson's youngest boy crept near the Sawyer fence line with stones in his pockets. He hurled them at the windows, the sound cracking glass and wood before he fled back into the trees. The next morning, the window stood patched with boards, no complaint given, no word spoken. But in the valley, the act was told with pride, passed from boy to boy as a kind of victory. A small one, but a beginning. Days later, a team of horses was found loose near the creek, their traces cut, their harness slashed. They belonged to a man who had spoken loudest in the meeting, his voice sharp with anger, his threats the clearest. He swore it was Sawyer work, that no one else had reason. He carried his anger into town, waving the cut leather as proof. No one doubted him. Whether the Sawyers had touched the harness or not no longer mattered. Blame had found its place, and it held. The valley shifted after that. Retaliations began to pass back and forth, small acts at first, then sharper. Fences were cut, gates unlatched, animals scattered. Wagons were found with wheels loosened, ploughs broken in the night, wells fouled with stones. Each act brought another in reply. The men who had crossed the fence spoke with more heat, claiming the Sawyers had struck first, had struck harder, had struck without fear. The Sawyers answered only with silence, yet their silence was louder than any denial. By harvest, the valley was divided not only in suspicion but in open feud. Families who once spoke across fields now turned their backs. Men carried rifles more often than tools, their eyes fixed on the line of the creek as if expecting movement at any hour. Children were kept closer, women moved in pairs, dogs were tied near barns at night. The ordinary life of Shadow Creek was still lived, fields planted, animals tended, suppers eaten, but all of it under the shadow of the Sawyers, all of it edged with fear. One night in October, the first true blood was spilled in retaliation. Carver's elder son, walking back from town, did not return. His body was found near the creek, his head struck, his chest stilled. The tracks around him were muddled, the mud thick with the prints of struggle. No one saw who dealt the blow, but no one doubted where to place blame. The valley carried his body home with torches, their light burning against the dark, their anger burning hotter than ever. The Sawyers made no word, no explanation, no denial. Their lantern burned, their smoke rose, their mule strained at the plough, and in that stillness the valley's anger swelled beyond return. It was no longer a matter of suspicion, no longer a question of proof. It was feud, open and undeniable, marked in blood on both sides of the creek. The retaliation had begun. Shadow Creek would never again know peace. By the 10th year of the Sawyers' presence, Shadow Creek was no longer a valley of neighbors bound by the rhythm of planting and harvest. It had become a valley divided, a place where every fence post carried weight, every footstep along the creek was measured, every word spoken carried the edge of suspicion. The feud, once only whispers, had grown into a shadow that touched every house, every field, every family. The blood of Carver, and later his son, still lingered in every telling. Their names were spoken in church, at the store, in the fields, always with the same conclusion. The Sawyers had taken them. No man claimed to see it done, yet every man knew it as truth. And in Shadow Creek, knowing became believing, and believing became the law that guided action. That winter had been harsh, the snow deep, the winds cutting through every crack in every wall. Families burned wood faster than they had stacked it, their barns drawn thin of grain. Yet through the storm, the Sawyer place remained steady. Their smoke never faltered, their animals did not starve, their lantern burned long into the night. To their neighbors, this was not proof of labor, but of theft. How else, they asked, could a family stand so firm while the valley bent under hardship? By spring, the valley's patience had thinned to nothing. Small retaliations had grown into steady rhythm. Wagons tampered with, animals gone missing, fences torn in the night. Each act was answered by another, each wrong repaid in kind, until it seemed the whole valley lived not in seasons, but in cycles of vengeance. Men no longer spoke of if the feud would end, but when and how much blood would be spent before it did. The breaking came in late June, under a sun that beat hard against the fields, the air thick and still. It began, as much had before, with loss. Stenson's second barn, rebuilt after the fire that had marked the early years of the feud, was found burned again, this time reduced to blackened beams before water could reach it. The blaze was fierce, the smoke visible across the valley, and though no one saw who set it, the story carried quick and sure. The Sawyers had struck again. The men gathered that very night. In the store, lanterns hung low, their light catching on rifles leaned against the wall, on axes propped beside boots. Stenson's voice carried sharp, his anger fanned by the smoke of his ruined barn. Carver's younger son spoke too, his words heavy with grief and fury. Others joined, each carrying his own wound, fences cut, animals lost, insults endured. By the time the meeting ended, the course was set. They would not wait. They would not call for law from outside. Shadow Creek would settle its own matters. The Sawyers had brought blood to the valley, and the valley would answer in blood. At dawn, they gathered. Nearly 30 men, some mounted, some on foot, all armed. Rifles slung across backs, pistols at belts, axes in hands, pitchforks sharpened to points. Their faces were hard, their voices low, their steps steady as they turned toward the creek. Behind shuttered windows, women and children watched, silent witnesses to what could not be stopped. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as the line of men crossed the ridge and descended toward the far bank. The Sawyer place stood still, the barn doors shut, the house quiet, the fields empty. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady as always. When the men reached the fence, they did not stop this time. Rails were torn free, posts pulled from the earth, and with a surge of boots and voices, they crossed onto Sawyer land. The first shout rose from the porch. Silas Sawyer stepped out, his figure framed by the doorway, his face as unreadable as ever. Behind him, Merle stood with the daughter at her side, the boys already in the yard, tools in hand that could as easily serve as weapons. For the first time in all their years at Shadow Creek, The family stood not only in silence but in defense, their line drawn across their own ground. Voices clashed across the yard. Accusations, demands, threats. Stenson shouted of his barn, Carver's son shouted of his father, others shouted of animals, tools, fences, blood. The Sawyers gave no word, no denial, no plea. Their silence was not absence but answer, as though they had carried it too long to break now. Then the first shot cracked the air. No one knew whose rifle it was, no one claimed it after, but its sound split the morning wide. The mule reared in its pen, dogs barked, children screamed from doorways beyond the creek, and in that instant the valley broke. Gunfire answered gunfire. Axes swung, pitchforks thrust, boots trampled earth. The yard filled with the sound of struggle, shouts, cracks, the tearing of wood, the cries of men struck. Smoke from rifles mingled with the smoke from the chimney, until the air itself burned. How long the fight lasted, no one could later say. Some swore it was minutes, others an hour, but in the heat of it time bent and lost shape. What is certain is that when silence finally fell, Shadow Creek was changed beyond return. Bodies lay in the yard, men of the valley and Sawyers alike. Blood soaked the dust, spread across the fence posts, darkened the porch steps. The barn stood half-splintered, its doors broken, its roof torn. The house still stood, though its windows shattered, its walls scarred by bullets and blows. The smoke that rose then was not steady but broken, curling through shattered beams and open sky. The men who survived withdrew slowly, carrying their wounded, dragging their dead. Their faces were grey, their voices gone, their anger hollowed by the weight of what had been done. They had come to settle, to end, to make right. What they carried back was not victory but ruin. The Sawyers, too, were broken. Silas lay among the fallen, his silence ended. Merle stood bloodied at the porch, the daughter at her side, her stillness sharper than ever. The boys, their bodies marked with cuts and bruises, stood over the wreckage of their ground, their faces hard as stone. They had not yielded, they had not spoken, they had not fled. But what remained of them was no longer whole. Shadow Creek, from that day, bore the mark of the breaking point. The feud had reached its end not in peace but in blood, not in justice but in ruin. The Sawyers remained, but not as before. The valley remained, but never as it had been. The creek still ran, the fields still turned, the seasons still passed. But beneath it all, in every fence post, in every furrow, in every stone along the bank, the story of the Sawyers lingered, America's most murderous clan, set apart, silent, unyielding, and forever bound to the land they scarred. And that was the dark legacy of the Sawyers of Shadow Creek, a feud carved in blood and silence. If you were pulled into this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share to keep the fire of history alive. This is eternal Obsidian, where the shadows speak, and the past is never buried.